Hello everyone, and welcome to Vlogitas. I'm Phil Ramsey, and as we've said many times, this is where we Vlogitas, we read the Bible and, basically chapter and verse, and not quite like that. I mean, there's things that we skip out, like for example, we are not starting in Genesis 38 today. Instead, we're going to start Genesis 39, so we're just going to skip that chapter altogether. That chapter deals with some adult issues. It's a lesson in learning about how two people can do wrong, but one person can be more wrong than another. And but I'm not going to get into all that, like I said. So again, we are just that continual reading of the Word. That's why we do this every day, Monday through Friday, so that there's that. It's not about, everyone seems to want to, I mean, I pastored for a long time. A lot of people just want a quick fix. I want a quick fix. But we're seeing that the reason that the major issues that were happening in the lives of these people, the reason that they were resolved is because they had an ongoing relationship with God. And that takes that continual inputting of His Word in doses, if you will, because, we do need the occasional awesome message and teaching, but if you want to have success in your Christian walk, you're going to have to actually be in the Word a lot more than just on a Sunday and church. And your kids are also going to need a lot more than just 2 hours of church, 3 hours of church a week. It just will not cut it, especially in this day and age where our senses are constantly being bombarded with things that are not of God. And the things that we see, the ads and whatever, things that come up. And so today we're going to do chapters 39, 40, and 41. I'm going to try to keep it, between 20 and 30 minutes, preferably not longer than 30 minutes. And so don't let this boring introduction stop you from finishing the video, please, because it gets pretty exciting when you get into it. Right now we're looking at Joseph's story. I am going to be skipping, part of, starting with the end of verse 6 and going down through verse 19. And that's where, I used to explain to my kids, because it's an important thing to explain, because it's why Joseph ended up in prison unjustly. But it is pretty, like a soap opera type, pretty explicit stuff that happens, or graphic stuff that happens. And but what I would explain to my kids is, it's just simply that Potiphar's wife wanted Joseph to do husband and wife things with her that are, it was not appropriate, and it would have broken God's law. Joseph says that. And so she's not his wife. She wanted him to do husband and wife things with her. And for a little kid, I think that's enough to say, because they probably just think, oh, wow, what is that? Well, we'll tell you when you're older, So you can read it yourself. Obviously, you've got the Word in front of you. So we're going to go ahead and start with verse 1 in chapter 31. Oh, let me get into it. Also in chapter 40, I do also skip verse 19 and a couple words in verse 22. What I always just do is because that's the dream where Joseph explains to the two prisoners. One of them's going to get restored to their position. The other one's going to get executed. I just use the word executed rather than going into the graphic way the Bible explains how it took place. And so executed works just fine. You don't really need to explain any more than that. I also, it happens again in verse 13 of chapter 41. And that's it. Let's go ahead and get into it, because I'm raring to go here. So, Genesis 31, verse 1. When Joseph was taken to Egypt by the Ishmaelite traders, he was purchased by Potiphar, an Egyptian officer. Potiphar was captain of the guard for Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Take note of that. It's important for later in the story, that he's been purchased as a slave by the captain of the guard. So the Lord was with Joseph, So he succeeded in everything he did as he served in the home of his Egyptian master. Potiphar noticed this and realized that the Lord was with Joseph, giving him success in everything he did. This pleased Potiphar, so he soon made Joseph his personal attendant. He put him in charge of his entire household and everything he owned. From the day Joseph was put in charge of his master's household and property, the Lord began to bless Potiphar's household for Joseph's sake. All his household affairs ran smoothly, and his crops and livestock flourished. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibility over everything he owned. While Joseph was there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. How'd you like that? Your household is so successful that it's just like all you have to do is pick up a menu and say, I'd like to have this and this and this. And so that's exactly the kind of life that Potiphar was living, with Joseph taking care of everything for him, and Joseph was faithful. God had given Joseph this amazing administrative gift, but there's also that covenant blessing that we talked about. So once again, we see somebody else who's not a part of the covenant being blessed as a result of a covenant person being in their home. It happened with, we saw that happen with Jacob when he was in Laban's house, and Laban didn't want him to leave because he was his household was flourishing because he was there. And it just goes back to the promise. It's a sound bite, or by comparison of the blessing that God said. He said, through you all the families of the earth will be blessed. But this is just in the direct vicinity, in the direct area of people that were around a covenant person. They were being blessed, and it's an overflow blessing, if you will, where God's like, through you they will be blessed. And so now we see through Jesus, our relationship that we have with Jesus, and the blessing of salvation that goes out from our relationship with Him when we share Him with other people, and then they accept Jesus, and so then they have the blessing of salvation, and then it just goes on, and it goes on and on like ripples in a pond. That's the way God desired it to be. That's why Jesus is called the seed of the woman, because a seed grows and you have a harvest, and it goes on from there. And so it's through us that God desires to bless. And so Potiphar is very blessed. Well, now at this point, you get to the end of verse 6 that we just read, which says Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man. And then you find out that's where Potiphar's wife wants to do husband and wife things with Joseph. That's not appropriate because she is somebody else's wife. And go down to verse 20. So he, Potiphar, took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. That's because Potiphar's wife got mad that Joseph would not do what she wanted, and so she went and made up some lie to her husband, and he normally probably would have been executed for that. But I personally believe that Potiphar didn't believe her, but so he didn't want to kill Joseph, so instead he threw him in prison. But again, that's my personal take on it. That's just what I think. So verse 20. So he took Joseph and threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. But the Lord was with Joseph in the prison and showed him His faithful love. And the Lord made Joseph a favorite with the prison warden. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and over everything that happened in the prison. The warden had no more worries because Joseph took care of everything. The Lord was with him and caused everything he did to succeed. And so Joseph is experiencing a lot of hardships. He was, his brothers sell him into slavery. He gets sent down to a foreign land, doesn't know the language, doesn't know anybody. He's sold in as a slave. He does extremely well for his master. He's very faithful, and his master put him in charge of everything he owned. Well, you don't do that for the person who's crying in the corner about all their problems. It's the person who steps up and says, yeah, I'm going through all these things, but I'm going to make the best of it. I'm going to serve God. I'm going to do the best I can. That's the person you put in charge of your household. So then he's wrongfully accused of something he didn't do. And then he's thrown in prison, and now God gives him, it makes him a favorite, and we call that in Christianese, and it's biblical, but we say that's favor. God gives you favor with people who otherwise wouldn't like you. And so the prison warden is like, I like this guy. I'm going to put him in charge of the prison. And so he takes care of all the prisoners. And Joseph probably was in a position where he could have hatched some kind of escape plan, but he didn't do it. Instead, he just is faithful, and he continues to serve. and which is going to give him even more favor, right? He's going to have even more favor, and so we say favor, but it's this translation says God made him a favorite with the prison warden, and favor comes from that word favorite. And so here we go. So the Lord was with him, caused everything he did to succeed. Chapter 40. Sometime later, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their royal master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he put them in the prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. There's the captain of the guard again. Potiphar took Joseph and put him in his personal prison. It's the prison where, and Potiphar apparently still wasn't there, but the warden of the prison, who was under Potiphar, took care of Joseph and put him in charge of everything. So there's favor even in the prison, even in the low place. There's favor that God has for us. Okay, so verse 4: they remained the butler and the baker, not the candlestick maker. He wasn't there, but it was the cupbearer and the chief baker. So verse 4: they remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph. Potiphar assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them, because Potiphar is the captain of the guard. Verse 5: while they were in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. When Joseph saw them the next morning, he noticed that they both looked upset. "Why do you look so worried today?" he asked them. And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." "Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." And I heard a teacher one time talking about this, and it was very good. The question posed to God was, "How is this? This is awful. This is not fair. How is he ending up? He hadn't even seen his own dreams realized, and now he's got to help with these dreams." And God spoke to him and said, "Until you learn to sow into the dreams of others, you'll never see your dreams realized." And so there's other people too that we need to look to. We can't just look out for ourselves. And so Joseph, now you got to love Joseph. Verse 8: they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean. Interpreting dreams is God's business," Joseph replied. "Go ahead and tell me your dreams." So I love how Joseph just puts this in God's court. He's like, "God, God's the one who interprets dreams. Go ahead and tell me your dreams." And I think that what Joseph is doing is staying neutral. If God's going to give him an interpretation, he'll pass it on. If not, then he's like, well, God must not have wanted to interpret that dream. It's very important to think that way. So verse 9: so the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a grapevine in front of me. The vine had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom, and soon it produced clusters of ripe grapes. I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches represent 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your position as his chief cupbearer. And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh, so he might let me out of this place. For I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given the first dream such a positive interpretation, he said to Joseph, "I had a dream too. In my dream, there were 3 baskets of white pastry stacked on my head. The top basket contains all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head." "This is what the dream means," Joseph told him. "The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. In 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and execute you." Verse 20. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later, and he prepared a banquet for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join the other officials. He then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh executed the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. Chapter 41. And this can be, got to bear with me because this chapter can be a little long. 2 full years later, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile, but these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the riverbank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up, but he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these thin heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized it was a dream. The next morning Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dreams, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. Finally, the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. "Today I have been reminded of my failure," he told Pharaoh. "Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant, and everything happened just as he predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed." Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went in and stood before Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I had a dream last night, but no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it." Verse 16. Gotta love Joseph's heart. "It is beyond my power to do this," Joseph replied. "But God can tell you what it means and set you at ease." So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. He's going to relate the whole dream again. "In my dream," he said, "I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterward you wouldn't have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up." And here's a side note. I managed to sit in on a friend of mine's class over at Rhema, and he's teaching he's actually teaching on the book of Exodus, but he mentioned that it's important to talk about the flood before you start talking about what happened in Exodus. And the research that they've done down in Egypt, it's obvious that the Nile River, they were completely dependent upon the Nile River to irrigate their crops down in Egypt and at that time. And so if the river, there was a certain time of year that it was supposed to swell, and it came up to a certain height, and then it would go back down. Well, now that would water all of this area. Then they were able to irrigate. They were able to plant, and that also, of course, would restore the nutrients to the soil, making the crops good and vital, I guess is a good word. But then also, though, if the flooding was too much, then it would actually cause a famine, because if the water stayed too long, then it ruined all of their cropland. And so the prevailing theory, and it seems about right, is that probably what caused this was actually a flood that messed up all of their land. That caused that 7-year period of famine. And it makes sense, because in the dream, the cows come up out of the river, and the good fat cows, those 7 years of really great crops, were produced by an exceptionally good swelling of the river that then went back down. But then if the river came back and swelled up too much following those years, then it would cause this drought. Well, the good cows come up out of the Nile, and then the scrawny cows also come up out of the Nile. And so it looks like, from the biblical interpretation or the dream that Pharaoh had, that the Nile was going to be the cause of both of those things, both the great bumper crop years and the bad years. That's just an interesting thing. So now verse 22, he's gonna talk about the heads of grain. "In my dream I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind, and the shriveled heads swallowed the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean." Joseph responded, "Both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later, and the 7 thin heads of grain withered by the east wind, represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout all the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine, so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having two similar dreams, it means that these events have been decreed by God, and he will soon make them happen. Therefore, or for this reason, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise this famine will destroy the land. Verse 37. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt." Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in a chariot reserved for his second in command, and wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, "Kneel down." So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, "I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval." Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah. He also gave him a wife whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. So what qualifies Joseph to be able to inspect the entire land of Egypt? Talking about an entire country, and at this time a very powerful country. Well, when he was working for his father back in the land of Canaan, he learned the shepherding trade, knew all about animals. Then he comes down and he's a slave of Potiphar, and he learned about not only managing a household but managing crops, because it says Potiphar's crops flourished. So he learned about farming. He learned about how that works. He learned all about how to manage a household and run a household. And then he ends up in the prison. He learns how to manage rough men who have been sit there for whatever reason. He knows how to manage that. He can take care of that, and he can deal with hard personalities. And so now he is completely qualified to be able to inspect the entire land of Egypt, and also be able to know how to manage all of the crops that are going to come in, also manage all the people who are going to be coming looking to buy crops after that, and be able to handle all different kind of difficult situations. God is a genius. He helps people achieve what they need to achieve by giving them the skills they need to acquire. Sometimes we need to go through hard times to acquire the skills that we need. Doesn't always happen that way, but in this case it did. So, verse 47, as predicted, for 7 years the land produced bumper crops. During those years Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain, like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, "God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family." And so, that's interesting. The name I didn't notice that before. The name that Pharaoh gave Joseph was Zaphanath-Paneah. It says Zaphanath-Paneah probably means God speaks and lives, because Joseph would have been that living representation of God, standing right before him. It's awesome. So then Manasseh sounds like a Hebrew term that means causing to forget. And so God made me forget all my troubles. Everyone's in my father's family. That's not really quite the case. Otherwise, he wouldn't have bothered to name him that. It's like that denial thing. Well, God made me forget all that. Well, no, you're still thinking about it. It's still before you, and we'll see that happen next time we read. We'll see that comes up again. So then Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, "God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief." Ephraim sounds like a Hebrew term that means fruitful. So then verse 53, at last the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. Then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well, and when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." So, with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe throughout the world. And so we'll stop there, and we'll continue on with this. Really, it's a saga of Joseph's life, but it's speaks to our history as well. Anyone who serves Christ, anyone who serves Jesus, this is part of our history as well. So, Father, I thank you for everyone who watches, and I thank you, Lord, that you're helping all of us. You're stirring up in our heart the things that you desire for us to know, and to learn your word, and to learn who you are better and better. And I thank you, Father God, for everything. And in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. So bless you guys, and we will see you next time.